this lecture, we will continue to explore the rich collection of 16th century Italian paintings in the National Gallery by returning to central Italy. In the first 2 decades of the 16th century, the art of this region, Florence and Rome, was really dominated by the major artistic personalities we have already seen, Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. But by the middle of 1520, only Michelangelo of these three was still alive, and he was increasingly more active as a sculptor and architect than as a painter. In part because of this vacuum, but also because of changing taste and situations, we start to see a new style arise after 1520, a style that came to be called Mannerism. Mannerism was based on the innovations of the High Renaissance, but it had a slightly different emphasis, more emphasis on the artistic virtuosity of painters and showing that off, and less emphasis on the idealized naturalism of a figure such as Raphael or Leonardo. Mannerist painters, for instance, often featured spatial tricks in their paintings or worked with enigmatic subjects. And this also implies something about their patronage, that these works were created for discerning art patrons. The art historian John Shearman once characterized Mannerism as the stylish style, and I think this really brilliantly encapsulates what was important to the artists and the patrons about this kind of work. Let us start with Jacopo da Pontormo's Joseph with Jacob in Egypt from about 1518, which is a very good example, an early example of this new style. Multiple episodes take place in a scene where the perspectival construction appears to confuse us more than clarify how things should be read. The figures here are elegant but distorted in their elongated proportions, and there are some elements of the painting that seem to have been included almost a bit whimsically. Jacopo Carucci, whose dates were 1494 to 1557, and who was called Jacopo da Pontormo, from Pontormo, trained in Florence with Leonardo and Piero di Cosimo, two figures we have already seen. While he began as a painter in the High Renaissance tradition, in 1518, by this time he had already developed elements of this new style of Mannerism that rejected some basic components of the High Renaissance. This is one of the very first paintings that he made in this new style that was later dubbed Mannerism. It's important to realize it was not called that at the time. Now, Joseph with Jacob in Egypt is one of a group of 4 paintings that Pontormo made for one client in Florence, Pier Francesco Borgherini. They were commissioned in connection with Borgherini's marriage in 1515, and it appears they were made for the marital chamber. Works were commissioned from other Florentine artists as well. All of the paintings by Pontormo for this commission are in the National Gallery, and the one we are seeing is the very last painting of the 4. They illustrate episodes from the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob, had been abducted and sold into slavery through the treachery of his own brothers. After a series of difficulties, he rose to become the chief advisor to the Pharaoh in Egypt. Later, he is reunited with his family when they are all brought to Egypt. Pontormo has told the story on a square panel, not on a canvas, and not on an oblong-shaped one as one would normally expect with a story where you are telling it with a linear timeline. Now, this may have had to do with its original location, the actual space of this bedchamber, but it also appears that Pontormo enjoyed working with the challenges of this format, working with it both as a painter but to present new challenges for his audience as well. The story zigzags through space, beginning at lower left, and there we see, at a doorway scene, the meeting of Joseph and Pharaoh. These are the largest figures in this composition. Then we move over to the right-hand foreground, where we see Joseph being petitioned by one of Pharaoh's subjects. So we see Joseph here working as the vizier in Egypt. We next have to follow the figures going up the staircase, this very strange-looking staircase, where we see Joseph with one of his sons walking up to the top, Finally, we zigzag over to the right, and there is the deathbed scene of Jacob with Joseph and his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. We can recognize Joseph. He wears the same color robe, this lavender-colored robe in each scene, and that does help us read it a little bit, so that it's complicated and difficult to follow at first. Meanwhile, here, the entire left background scene is given over to a very picturesque rendering of a town, but doesn't look very much like one in Egypt. And in fact, it much resembles the architecture found in engravings by a Dutch printmaker from this time named Lucas van Leyden. There are accessory figures throughout the painting and others who observe the incidents going on. All of this, again, complicating our understanding of what really counts here. Also, how do we describe some of these odd details, such as the triumphal cart pulled by putti in which Joseph sits when meeting with this petitioner? What about the odd cylindrical architecture and this open staircase that makes no sense, really, of the building at the right? What meaning, if any, is there to all the statuary that is scattered throughout the scene? The poses of figures are exaggerated here. Look, for instance, at the left hand of Joseph as he points to Jacob when they meet with Pharaoh. The colors throughout are vivid and attractive, but they don't seem to respond to normal spatial cues the way we expect in high Renaissance art. That is, they never become lighter as we move further into space. They maintain their brightness throughout. The word artifice comes to mind to describe such a painting, which also highlights Pontormo's creative imagination and his ability to distort the representation of space in a way that only someone who knew how to do it properly really could. That is, you have to have the skill to know how to do a proper perspectival construction before then starting to manipulate and distort it. What messages we are meant to learn from the story itself are far less clear in this case. Now, according to Vasari, Pontormo included a portrait of his young apprentice, Agnolo di Cosimo, in this painting. He's sitting on the steps at the right foreground, dressed in brown. This apprentice was called Il Bronzino. His dates were 1503 to 1572. And he would follow Pontormo's lead in developing his own highly virtuosic and highly artificial style. There are 5 paintings by Bronzino in the National Gallery. Bronzino served as a court painter to the Medici family in Florence and was associated with intellectuals there as a poet as well as a painter. Bronzino's allegory with Venus and Cupid from the 1540s was likely a present from Duke Cosimo I to Francis I, King of France. And I have to stop and give a little history again for a second. After having been ousted from Florence a second time, 1527 to 1530. The Medici came back again to rule Florence and were even more powerful the second time around, eventually ruling other centers in Tuscany as well as Florence itself. In this way, Duke Cosimo would have certainly thought of himself as an equal to Francis I, who greatly admired Italian culture. Now, the allegory with Venus and Cupid is, for me, an almost equally fascinating and repellent painting. It's the kind of painting that compels your interest, but makes you feel a little strange even while you're looking at it. Vasari wrote about it, telling us that the 2 principal figures are Venus and her son Cupid, and that other figures represent pleasure, play, fraud, and jealousy. Although Vasari does not mention him, the winged old man with an hourglass at his shoulder at top right is clearly Father Time himself. So something here is about Venus, an allegory seen through time or over time. Unfortunately, scholars disagree about which figures symbolize which characteristics actually named by Vasari, and no one has to date come up with a convincing interpretation to explain all of the characters we see here. Pentimenti and infrared evidence tell us that Bronzino continued to make changes to this work, adding and subtracting elements while in the course of executing it, which to me seems to be a clue that meaning here was really always very fluid. The eroticized, seemingly incestuous relationship of Cupid and his mother would be particularly disturbing, I think, for most modern viewers, in part because of Bronzino's own technical skills. He depicts these figures so naturalistically within a context that is otherwise considerably unnaturalistic, and really makes us focus on them in this sort of this kind of queasy-making scene for us. The pigments used here are of the highest quality. Look at that blue drape held up in back, and it is made using ultramarine, that very expensive pigment we've encountered before. Note, too, how Bronzino exploits the smooth quality of oil paint on a wooden panel to achieve this highly polished surface appearance, almost as if these figures were made from marble. The spatial tension in the work, where the figures are all seemingly caught up in this blue drape held by Father Time and a masked character at the left, along with the kind of weird figures we see here. Look at the creature with the head of a girl who has a reptilian tail with a stinger on it, all make for a really hallucinatory image. Most scholars believe that this allegory must warn against the dangers of impure love and self-indulgence. The howling figure we see at the far left has even been interpreted as a representation of syphilis, which was first ravaging Europe in the 16th century. Perhaps Bronzino and Cosimo wished to cater to the tastes of Francis I. He had a collection of erotica kept separately from the rest of his art collection, and they would do so here, cater to these tastes in an intellectualized and sophisticated manner that could provide something entertaining for discussion and show off the advances of Italian art. But we are clearly here far from the world of Raphael's Madonna and Child paintings. Bronzino and Pontormo were active in Florence, but what was happening in other central Italian cities? We will turn next to Rome briefly, which, after such a brilliant start in the first 2 decades of the century, lost its position as an artistic center because of political and social turmoil in the 1520s. The National Gallery owns 4 paintings by the artist Girolamo Francesco Maria Mazzola, whose dates were 1503 to 1540. He was called Parmigianino, or Little One from Parma, and was trained in this city by his uncles. Parmigianino worked in Rome for 3 years only, from 1524 to 1527, during the pontificate of Clement VII, and received some important commissions in that time. Unfortunately, Rome was sacked by the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1527, which devastated the artistic and commercial life of the city. Like many other artists, Parmigianino fled Rome. I had worked in other centers. A short-lived artist, he was greatly admired by his contemporaries. There is a large altarpiece by Parmigianino in the National Gallery in London, but I would like to try my own little mannerist trick and concentrate instead on a very small religious painting by him, occasionally overlooked in this collection. The Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine was likely painted in Bologna, where he lived from 1527 to 1530. It best represents for me the quality of his art most admired by his contemporaries, grazia, or grace. We have seen St. Catherine of Alexandria before with her attribute, a wheel. The specific subject represented by Parmigianino, the mystic marriage of the saint to Jesus, was a popular one in 15th and 16th century art. According to the Golden Legend, a 4th century pagan princess of Alexandria vowed only to marry a man who was perfect in virtue and wisdom. She was visited by the Christian hermit Adrian, who had been sent by the Virgin Mary to help lead Catherine to her mate. Catherine, upon converting to Christianity, was permitted a vision of heaven in which she received a ring from Jesus as her spiritual bridegroom. She then helped to convert others until she was imprisoned under Emperor Maxentius. Her jailers tried to torture her by binding her to 4 spiked wheels, but the wheels flew into pieces when the attempt was made. She was beheaded instead. Often the mark of a true saint is you don't hurt them the first time around. The customary depiction of the story is a variation on the imagery of the Virgin and Christ child. Here, Catherine kneels at right, grasping her wheel with her left hand, while her right is joined with the infant Christ's right hand, as he slips a ring with a blue stone onto her finger. He sits on Mary's lap, and she is turned in a profile view. In the left foreground, the head and left shoulder of an old man seen in profile, likely meant to be the hermit Adrian. In the background is a somewhat confusing scene. Are we seeing two figures in a doorway, or are we seeing a mirror image of Adrian and Catherine? This is the kind of spatial trick Manners artists so loved. The brushwork is highly visible here and suggests exactly this grazia of Parmigianino. Some called him the new Raphael for his grace and suavity. But compared to Raphael, Parmigianino has really moved away from naturalistic figure styles to create his own aesthetic, especially for women, who are shown as here as high-waisted figures with impossibly long legs, necks, and hands. They seem to have nary a bone in their body, but are extremely elegant, and say Catherine really elegant in an eroticized way. Now, in each case we've seen to date in this lecture, these paintings were done on panel, not on canvas. It is important to point out that Central Italian artists made that switch to canvas later than those of Northern Italy. These artists were all devoted draftsmen, as the generation of their teachers had been done, but less often from nature and more often making studies out of their own imagination. And perhaps it wouldn't surprise you to hear that both Pontormo and Parmigianino were seen by their own contemporaries as eccentric personalities. Another important artist of this time, who is actually more akin to the high Renaissance painters than the Mannerists, is Antonio Allegri, called Correggio for his birthplace. His dates were about 1489 to 1534. He's hard to fit into a really nice tight sequence of art history, since he worked a bit out of the way in Parma, where he influenced the young Parmigianino actually, but was not well known by some of his other Italian contemporaries. Yet later artists in the 16th and 17th centuries would be very much influenced by Correggio. He may have actually worked with the elderly Andrea Mantegna in Mantua at the very start of his career, and we know that Correggio was keen on Leonardo's art, which he would have seen in Milan. Finally, he also made a trip to Rome in 1519, where he was impressed by Raphael and Michelangelo. So here's an artist who has really been exposed to the various elements of high Renaissance art. There are 7 paintings by him in the National Gallery. We'll look at 2 right now. Venus with Mercury and Cupid from about 1525 suggests that Correggio was a worthy rival to Titian as a painter of classical mythologies. Here we see the young mischief maker Cupid being taught to read by Mercury, while his mother Venus, here shown unusually as winged, stands by. Some stories from antiquity claim that Mercury was actually Cupid's father. Others say that Mars, Venus's lover, was the father of Cupid. In Renaissance astrology, the planetary god Mercury was associated with learning and education. So whether this is a family scene or a school of love, as the traditional title states, his presence makes sense here. The figures are protected by a natural bower that is dappled with light. We can plainly detect Leonardo's influence in the softened contours of the figures and even the facial type of Venus. Her pose is loosely based on the ancient sculptural prototype called the Venus Pudica by the 4th century BC sculptor Praxiteles. But the gorgeous flesh here is really Correggio's own contribution. His mythological paintings are among the most sensuous of the 16th century. The painting may offer a lesson that even the impulses of passionate love can be contained through the civilizing effect of education. Yet the gorgeousness of the flesh suggests that such containment might only be partial. Correggio made some important changes to the painting while working on it. Most importantly, Venus originally looked down and Mercury looked out of the painting. The revision here, where Mercury looks down to Cupid, makes the relationship between them more effective and more tender, I think. In 1627, this painting was listed in the inventory of the Gonzaga collection in Mantua. Now, we know that a century before, Federico II Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua, commissioned a set of paintings from Correggio sometime in the 1520s, showing the loves of Jupiter that were intended as a present for Charles V. It is not impossible, therefore, that the Venus with Mercury and Cupid was made right around the same time for the Duke himself. By 1628, the painting had been sold from the Gonzaga collection and went to the famed painting collection of Charles I in England, which was later broken up and sold by the state after his execution. But that suggests the favor in which it was held. Another painting by Correggio, Christ Presented to the People, from about 1525 to 1530, shows how Correggio could apply the same sensuous style successfully to a painting of a religious subject. This is a small-scale devotional painting on panel of a subject popular in Northern Europe, but much less so in Italy. Correggio, in fact, may have been influenced by some Northern examples of the subject, but the execution is certainly entirely of his own style. The story comes from the Gospel of John in 19 and narrates the relevant part here of the Passion of Christ. After he has been scourged and crowned with thorns, he is brought before the people. Pontius Pilate said, "Behold the man, ecce homo," to the crowd gathered in Jerusalem. But the crowd demands Jesus' crucifixion. The usual presentation of the subject would include at least part of the crowd, but here we see only Jesus, a soldier who has led him out, Pilate on the left who points to Jesus, and most unusually, the Virgin Mary, who is fainting back in the arms of another follower. Sometimes such a close view is used for scenes of the mocking of Christ, but not for the presentation. This painting seems to stand halfway between serving as a kind of timeless icon of Christ's suffering for humankind and a dramatic rendering of a specific narrative moment. The softness of his figure style here and the rich depth of colors make this a beautiful painting, but I think also add to its emotional and psychological power. While Jesus does not make eye contact with the viewer, he does look out of the picture, seemingly contemplating his fate and accepting it willingly. Physical beauty here is meant to suggest spiritual beauty as well, and reminds us that within Christianity, Jesus has to be understood as both fully human and fully divine. Once more, it is useful to remember that aesthetic appeal and devotional functionality were not contradictory in this period. A painter active 2 generations later than Correggio, named Federico Barocci, whose dates were 1535 to 1612, unquestionably appreciated Correggio's achievements. Barocci's Madonna and Child with St. Joseph in the Infant Baptist from about 1575 conveys human warmth and artistic beauty in equal amounts. This is another one of those paintings that really calls you across the room. Barocci's career was spent in his birthplace, Urbino. We have seen before that as a ducal court, that was an important center of artistic patronage. He worked almost exclusively painting religious subjects, except for a few portraits of his patrons in Urbino, the Della Rovere dukes. Barocci also had an international audience, including some figures we have heard about before: Clement VII, Rudolph II of Prague, and Philip II of Spain. Now, this painting, which is alternatively called La Madonna del Gatto, the Madonna of the Cat, is really ravishing with bold and unusual color combinations, and it's that which really draws us to it. In comparison with something like Raphael's Garva Madonna, we can see how comparatively informal this painting seems in the organization of the figures and this behavior. Now, this is partly a result of a humbler conception of the Virgin Mary on Barocci's part, but it also reflected very important developments at this time for Christian art in Italy, precepts agreed upon at the Council of Trent that form the basis of the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent was held over a long period from 1545 to 1563, and was convened in response to the threat of the Protestant Reformation to the Church in Rome. And at this point, we really should call it the Roman Catholic Church. Many churchmen who remained loyal to the Catholic Church saw a need for reform in it nonetheless, in both the practices of the Church and even some beliefs, as a way of combating the appeal of Protestantism. It was only in the very last meetings of the Council in 1562 and 1563 that they got around to the questions of religious art for Catholicism. But the effects of the ideas raised there and then expanded on by writers of the late 16th century strongly affected Counter-Reformation art of the 16th century, at the end of it, and the 17th century. What about Barocci's painting is consonant then with the Counter-Reformation? Above all, art theorists of the movement disapproved of paintings that were too esoteric and difficult for ordinary people to understand. We might even think of Parmigianino here. This painting is really obvious in its meaning. We see the human nature of Jesus as an infant, supported by loving family members, the Virgin Mary, her husband Joseph, and the young John the Baptist. Mary is a really winsome young woman here, while Joseph is shown as a protective older man. Both seem very vulnerable and approachable in their humanity. And I can't think that there has ever been a more charming depiction of the infant Jesus than we see here with his curly blonde locks and look of pleasure as he nurses. These figures, too, behave in entirely human ways. John the Baptist, being a bit of an imp here, teases the household cat and terrifies the household pet goldfinch in youthful play. But these animals could also be understood symbolically. Goldfinches were known to swallow thorns and thus became associated with Christ's passion when he wore a crown of thorns. Cats are a little problematic, but they can be a symbol of evil and the devil. Perhaps St. John the Baptist is luring evil with a bird that symbolized Christ's eventual suffering and ultimate defeat of evil. Or are we overreading, and is sometimes a cat just a cat, a playful family pet? The composition is still symmetrical, though that's not the first thing we notice about the painting. The Virgin is in the center, but she has this wonderful twisted pose that seems very casual, and her feet jut out near the bottom left of the composition, nearly breaking through the picture plane and into the viewer's space. All of this makes the Holy Family seem more approachable. Finally, Barocci goes even further than Correggio in blending the contours of his figures so that they almost disappear. Nothing is hard-edged, paint is suavely stroked on. But we know that Barocci made many drawings in his career, and even in informal-seeming paintings such as this would have been prepared carefully. There are several other versions of this painting, but the pentimenti in this one really suggests that this was the first version of it. It was engraved in 1577 and had great international fame. Now, the use of prints to spread new ideas and styles during the course of the 16th century was terrifically important for disseminating, again, artistic innovation throughout Europe. But sometimes the travel of artists could achieve the same end. Niccolo dell'Abate, whose dates were about 1509 to 12 to 1571, was from Modena in northern Italy. He was influenced by Parmigianino and Correggio. He worked for ducal courts, so it's not surprising that in 1552 he actually went to France and worked for the French royal court, both out at Fontainebleau and in Paris. He was part of a whole team of Italian painters working there. The court of Henry II provided quite a few opportunities for artists from various European countries at mid-century. The Death of Eurydice is accepted as a work from Abate's Fontainebleau period, so from 1552 to 71. It depicts a story from Greek mythology about the ill-fated couple Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus, who we see in a meadow scene in the middle of the painting, was able to charm even wild beasts with his singing and lyre playing. But he unfortunately lost his wife Eurydice when she was bitten by a poisonous snake when trying to flee the amorous pursuit of the beekeeper's son of Apollo, Aristaeus. And we see those figures now, this pursuit of Eurydice by Aristaeus in the foreground, and then we see her dead body off to the right. Her fellow nymphs, who we see posed on the left side of the foreground, in revenge caused the death of Aristaeus' bees, and he went to his mother for help. We see them in the middle ground on the right side of the painting. She then sent him to talk to the sea god Proteus. He is lounging like a river god in the foreground on the right. And Proteus tells Aristaeus that the loss of his bees was punishment for pursuing Eurydice and causing her death. Now, Mannerist artists and their patrons loved abstruse subjects, and this one really fits the bill. But we have to ask how important the subject is here anyway. The figures here are small, and they don't really tell the details of this complicated story very well. What are the nymphs doing in the foreground, for instance? What role are they playing there? Why is Proteus lounging around like a river god in the right foreground, but not conversing with Aristaeus? This isn't meant as a criticism of the painting, but just to indicate that by this date, the ostensible subject was not really where the primary meaning was located. Instead, we have to consider the role of landscape here. What Niccolò has painted goes beyond what most Italian painters, even Venetian ones, had done in landscape in making it the primary concern. Here, with the large size of the painting, the viewer is really swept up in the scene. The idea of this extensive view of landscape where we actually can see to the far horizon here was also a new concept not found in Venice. We would call this a bird's eye view, as if we are the birds fluttering above and can see so far into the distance, where we also have a nice hazy atmospheric perspective. The beauties of this landscape are meant to evoke the sense of a lost golden age where gods and humans roam the earth together. So the mythological subject isn't meaningless here. It is just that the underlying meaning, the kind of nostalgia for the antique world, is best conveyed through nature itself. Now, the 16th century was a great period for exploration, as we know, in the New World, and it's not surprising that landscape becomes an independent subject at this time. At the court in Fontainebleau were a number of Netherlandish painters who could have brought this latest innovation in landscape to the attention of Dell'Abate, this extended scope and bird's eye view. This is likely how he arrived at this kind of new type, so once more we see Northern and Italian styles mixed. Mention, though, of landscape innovations and the relationship of Northern Italian art suggests that now we should return to the art of Northern Europe to see what transpired there in the 16th century.